So without further ado, I'd love to introduce you to Mohammed. And Mohammed is a PhD candidate at Cambridge, a historical sociologist who's been looking really at how we got into the mess that we're in. No, how the global order came to be, the history of capitalism. And I was so delighted when he agreed. He's a colleague of mine in the Pluto Educational Trust and beginning a new program there called the Decolonial Centre. But I was very happy when he explained what he wanted to give his keynote on, because those of you who are old hands in the movement may remember Michael Barrett Brown, who founded Twin and Twin Trading and wrote two incredibly important books, one called Fair Trade, Reform and Realities, which remains a bit of a classic of its time. I think Matthew might agree. And he also wrote something called The Economics of Imperialism, which starts with the tantalizing question, you know, how did we get away with it, white people? So without further ado, Mohammed, I'm passing it over to you, and very much welcome to this gang.
Thank you so much for having me. It's an absolute honor to be able to speak with you all. I'm but I'm hoping to start a conversation that, though I can't promise won't be contentious, will, I hope, be somewhat interesting. I come into this as a co-founder of a new organization, or a forthcoming project under the Pluto Educational Trust, called the Decolonial Centre. What we're also trying to do within the Pluto Educational Trust is to make sure that all of the different components of the trust work together. And because colonialism is a cross-cutting issue, I thought that it might be a wise thing to just underscore the importance of the history of colonialism and its relationship to the history of fair trade. The Decolonial Centre is basically trying to become a forum and an outlet for decolonial perspectives on current affairs, but also to raise awareness about the history of colonialism in Britain, and to make sure that we can almost culture jam in these times of culture wars, to make sure that people are aware of the true realities of the history of colonialism and not lots of the misinformation that has been spread these days by the right-wing press, etc. And so this is perhaps maybe one of the first public displays of the Decolonial Centre. And if you're interested, I will, after this conversation, make sure to put in my information. And if you're interested in collaborating in some kind of way, please do. But without further ado, I will begin this conversation. And I've written something here. So, the fair trade movement is in a period of deep reflection. It is also, perhaps one can say, in a point of crisis. Ever since the 1990s, the fair trade movement, until very recently, was considered as an exemplary commercial success story, proof that if given the decision, consumers would be willing and happy to pay more for an ethical cup of coffee, for example, than to be complicit in the continued exploitation of primary producers in the global South. There was a decision that was made during sometime in the 1990s, at the height of the green consumption era and the ethical consumption era, for the subcultural, progressive, and alternative trade movement, which evolved, for example, in the 70s and the 80s to circumvent Reagan's sanctions against the Sandinistas in Nicaragua, or to aid the broader movement trying to overthrow apartheid in South Africa. There was a conscious decision to make sure that this alternative trade movement would evolve into a fair trade movement. And the idea was that though alternative trade was an important project, which coupled itself with third world liberation movements, it now needed to be the case that fair trade products could be in every supermarket, not just to be consumed by progressives who might go out of their way to acquire them. Ethical consumption at the time, it was thought, could change the world and provide reprieve for farmers worried about bread and butter in a new unipolar world with the United States at the head of it. The idea was that it shouldn't have just been those producers who were lucky enough to be involved with alternative trade that could benefit, and it shouldn't have only been consumers of third world liberation shops somewhere in Greater London, for example, who could aid in the effort to develop a shadow but ethical economic system. The idea with fair trade certification was that far more producers of primary commodities in the global South should earn a fair day's wage for a fair day's work plus a premium, which they could use at their own behest to uplift their own communities. If this meant partnerships with corporations who had, until that moment, maybe derided fair trade, then so be it. For a long time, this worked to the extent that it brought fair trade into the mainstream. And though the anti-colonial ethos of the fair trade movement receded into the background, it was still best embodied in the symbolism of the first fair trade certification, that of Max Havelaar Coffee in the late 1980s in the Netherlands, itself based on an anti-colonial novel published in 1860 about how colonial terms of trade forced the Javanese to produce sugar and coffee for the masters of their country in the Netherlands instead of rice for themselves. The fair trade movement made peace with large conglomerates like Sainsbury's and Tesco and even Nestle. And that is how it grew into the juggernaut movement that it is, with over 1.66 million farmers in close to 1,500 producer organizations across the world. The problem today, though, is that now these very corporate partners have decided to go at it alone, developing their own certifications, abandoning fair trade, for example, for fairly traded products. Mondelez now has Cocoa Life, Nestle has Cocoa Plan, Starbucks has cafe practices, etc. Writing for The Guardian, Subramanian argues that they do this and they bring in-house, maybe because they feel that they could be more sustainable, but also to use fair trade for their own nefarious purposes. We are extremely concerned about the power and control that Sainsbury's seeks to exert over us, which actually feels reminiscent of colonial rule. These were the words that farmers in Africa used in responding to the news that now they would have to answer to a board in London to justify the use of their own well-earned premium. All of a sudden, we are back to square one. The decisions of farmers in the periphery are decided by board members in the core. Max Havelaar has lost the battle, but not the war. In a sense, the story of fair trade is intimately tied with the story of a world premised on the principle of free trade, which actually has historically masked the truth of globalization, which was secured through the divvying up of land and labor by Europe, the United States, the Ottomans, and Japan. In this sense, fair trade was expressly anti-imperialist just by its name, anti-colonial, a response to the imperialism of free trade. The name itself meant that free trade was the freedom for the powerful to exploit the poor, the colonizer to exploit the colonized. The subjects of imperialism were doubly free, free to submit or free to be thrown in concentration camps as they were in Kenya. Free trade was not fair. To not put forward a definitive typology on the origins of the fair trade movement, because I know that the story of where it began is contested, I'd like to propose three types of stories that fair traders tell about the history of fair trade. The first story is a story of ethical circumvention. For example, one story begins with Edna Ruth Tyler of the Mennonite Central Committee in 1942, importing needle crafts from low-income women in Puerto Rico, a colony of the United States, to be sold in charity stores and ethnic shops across America, to get around or to circumvent a system of colonialism which relied on the hyper-exploitation of Puerto Ricans. Byler set up 10,000 villages. And then there's a second type of story, which sees fair trade as perhaps peripheral to broader processes of social transformation in the era of decolonization. Here, fair trade becomes an ethos inspired, for example, by the 1968 UNCTAD Conference on Aid and Development, where the Global South coalesced into one bloc in the UN General Assembly, representing the global majority as the Group of 77, demanding a new world built on trade, not aid. I'm quite partial to a third kind of story. And what I would like to submit today is that it shouldn't only be an origin story, but a guide for the future of the fair trade movement. And that is the fusion of the two types of stories. Ethical circumvention as part of a process of systematic transformation. Now, I know that's a mouthful, but I hope it's the future of fair trade. Let me put it simply. What I envision is that we do not passively buy ethical products to ease our conscience. We know that fair trade products contribute to a very tangible and ecologically just transition to a new global economy. It was this idea, for example, which animated, to take one historical instance, the Quaker Free Produce Society in 1826 in the United States, when a specific segment of the Quaker Church built a movement to consciously source goods that were not produced by slave labor. This act of boycotting would have been nothing if it was just an end in and of itself. But the Quakers in the US knew that it needed to be part and parcel of a broader abolitionist movement, one intimately tied with the Underground Railroad and the movement to abolish slavery. It wasn't just that they were putting their money where their mouths were. They were also using their voices to overthrow the system of slavery. Yes, they circumvented the system of slavery, but they also sought to abolish it. If you have a project of circumvention without political action, then you tolerate exploitation outside of the markets that you interact with. But if you have a project of systematic transformation without ethical action, you fail to demonstrate that you can answer the problems of struggling working people in the here and now. For me, the project of fair trade must be both ethical and political, seeking to create a world where fair trade eventually abolishes itself. Today, we talk about a just transition, but once upon a time, there was talk of a new international economic order. That's what I'd like to explore today. What I'm proposing isn't a new idea, it's an old one. There was a time when people fought for fair trade to be one component of a broader project trying to conceive of a new international economic order. Even though many historians see the project as a failure, the fact that we can discuss it today is proof that the specter has not been exercised. For fair trade to realize its highest aspiration, it should openly and expressly, and this is probably the most controversial thing for me to say, advocate for supranational regulation over the supply chains of the world. It should openly and expressly advocate for supranational regulation over tax havens and supranational regulation over corporate power. If fair trade is now undergoing an unamicable divorce with the corporate world, well, it's only fair that the movement goes back to its roots and tries to rein corporate power in. This is if fair trade would like to be true to itself. Fair trade can no longer survive if it concedes to Thatcher's two dictums. One, that ethical consumption makes sense because there is no society, only families and individuals. And two, that families and individuals can only express their very personhood, not through solidarity with faraway societies, which of course Thatcher tells us don't exist, but through individual consumption. After all, as she put it, there is no alternative. But the world which she said there is no alternative to, which captured the imagination of even New Labour, has now broken down. We saw it burn in protests in Lebanon, Haiti, Chile, and even in the Enough is Enough campaign right here in Britain. The global pandemic that vaccine apartheid revealed, the global pandemic and the vaccine apartheid that it revealed, and now the impending ecological catastrophe that awaits us, are proving to us that global problems require global solutions. Neoliberalism was not the only alternative to the structural crises of the 1970s. And if we resurrect other proposed projects for the post-colonial, post-war order, perhaps we can give fair trade new purpose. The new international economic order was one proposition to overcome the structural crises of the global economy in the 1970s. Now, if you haven't heard about it, there's a reason for that. People don't want you to know about it. So what was it? Well, to put it very straightforwardly, it was a UN declaration approved by the General Assembly in 1974, which stated that in order to overcome, and I quote the document, the remaining vestiges of alien and colonial domination, foreign occupation, racial discrimination, apartheid, and neocolonialism. I mean, to imagine these were the language that was being used by the UN at the time. The global community needed to recognize that the New World Order after decolonization could not be premised on the pillar that, open quote again, the developing countries, which constitute 70% of the world's population, account for only 30% of the world's income. This was, after all, a time of incredible hope. With decolonization, it was hoped that the UN General Assembly could develop enough legislative power to correct colonial power imbalances on the world stage. With one member, one vote, the UN went from its inception after the war, from the Second World War, from having 51 member states to by 1962 having 110, most of which were new nations that had won their independence from the colonial powers through either protracted negotiations or armed struggle. At the second UNCTAD conference in 1968, the very same conference which inspired fair trade, 77 member states coalesced to forge the G77, all of whom worked together over the years to draw the contours of the new international economic order. The foundation of the United Nations and the Bretton Woods institutions proved that multilateral governance was possible. The rapid but yet incomplete decolonization meant that new voices could change the global agenda. The Marshall Plan, Soviet aid, and reparations to Jewish survivors of the Holocaust proved that resources could be transferred across the world from rich countries like the United States to the destroyed metropolises of Tokyo and Berlin. It meant that the richer countries could, in principle, accept their responsibility to help the poorer countries receive self-determination. Reparatory justice had enshrined itself as a principle of international law. And the OPEC oil embargo proved that resource-rich former colonies could bring Europeans to heel. The fiery new leaders of the post-colonial world had started to envision the UN as a kind of shop floor. In 1966, the Senegalese foreign minister Doudou Thiam took to the podium of the UN General Assembly to rally his equals. Open quote, he said, "For a long time prior to their independence, the developing countries had been seduced by the idea of the class struggle. But today, they realized that the essential problems for them was the elimination not so much of the proletariat classes as of the proletarian nations." Echoing a similar sentiment, Julius Nyerere of Tanzania argued that the UN should be a trade union of the poor. Inspired by the OPEC embargo, he even argued that if rich resource countries don't listen, maybe the poor countries could go on strike. UNCTAD, a UN agency headed by the Argentinian economist Raul Prebisch, was proof of cataclysmic changes. Its mandate was at the time premised on the Prebisch-Singer thesis, which Raul Prebisch was helped write, which stated that absent regulatory intervention, there would be a deterioration of the terms of trade between primary commodity producer countries, the kinds of countries that fair trade tries to empower, and manufacturing countries. And this would forever mean that if there weren't changes to the global economy, poor, formerly colonized countries which produce primary commodities like cocoa or sugar would never be able to develop. International trade needed to be managed, and there needed to be the transfer of resources from richer countries to poorer countries. So, for example, farmers in the primary commodity producer countries wouldn't just need a fair trade movement to defend themselves from unscrupulous multinational corporations who seek to take advantage of economic imbalances that were forged during the colonial period. I think all of these political and economic circumstances and the creative ideas that were developed to address them laid the groundwork for Hurari Boumediene, the leader of Algeria, to address in April 1974 the UN and declare the foundation of the new international economic order, which was passed by most member states. And what was it that he called for? He had a very expansive vision. Developing companies would seize control of their own natural resources. Multinational corporations would be expropriated. Commodity export prices would be fixed. Cartels would be substituted for the market. The world's monetary system would be reformed. The UN would create a special fund to serve the world's desperate people. And as the OPEC embargo, which successfully even forced some European countries to admonish Israel for the Yom Kippur War proved, the G77 would go on strike to ensure this would happen. It's not difficult to see how this level of daring to reimagine the global economy aided the fair trade movement. The fair trade movement wasn't just a consumer movement within this time. It was a flank of a broader transformative process, which was trying to enshrine fair trade into international law. Even the United States didn't know what to do with this. Kissinger, for example, promised to have discussions on the creation of a supranational authority that would regulate commodity prices of bauxite, tin, and copper. He promised to expand US food production and build a fund for the poorest countries. He confided to President Gerald Ford that the, open quote, theology about the merits of the free market economy, which the US now spreads across the world, won't work to divide the G77. Food, he hoped, would wean countries like India away from the Soviet Union. In another memo, he said, open quote, "We have to avoid an international dispute where Americans say the existing system is great and the less developed countries call for a new economic order. This is a losing wicket. The basic strategy," he said, open quote, "must be to hold the industrialized powers behind us and split the third world." The goal, he said, was to pull the new international economic order's teeth and divide these countries up. And certainly that happened. What we saw instead was a coup in Chile, the triumph of structural adjustment programs, the Washington Consensus, and the birth of global neoliberalism instead. So what's the point of me bringing all of this up? What does any of this have to do with fair trade? Well, on the one side, the NIEO, the New International Economic Order, demonstrated a kind of enthusiasm of supranational and multilateral governance that seems remote from the kind of celebration of small peasant communities that the alternative trade movement, and now the fair trade movement, champions. But there was a time when the two projects saw themselves as doing the same thing. For example, as Matthew Anderson's magisterial history of the fair trade movement in Britain demonstrates, who we're lucky to have with us today, The Trade Union Committee for International Cooperation, formed in 1976, sought to bring together the fair trade movement and the trade union movements to, open quote, increase the solidarity of all workers in the support of the objectives of a new international economic order. That was 1 year after the declaration was signed. In fact, when organizations like the Trade Union Congress were reluctant because of economic nationalism to support, for instance, tea workers exploited by British corporations in Sri Lanka, it was the fair trade movement which carried the mantle of international unionism. Oxfam and other pioneers of the movement debated extensively on how the emerging alternative trade movement could help build up a new international order. They supported, for instance, the Brand Report to the UN, which argued in 1980 that the main goals of the new international economic order needed to be established for global welfare. But also, more importantly, when in 1984, the Greater London Council, then under the leadership of Ken Livingstone, established a Third World Project, a central element of it was the Fair Trade Twin Trading Company. It wasn't just about easing the conscience of their consumers. In the founding document of this alternative trading company, which Margaret Thatcher was so alarmed by that she derided it as Ken Livingstone's primary apparatus for his own foreign policy, they argued that the purpose of the company wasn't just to sell fair trade products, but as an innovative program bringing fair trade, labor, and the trade union movement together, open quote, in transferring technology to work in the third world, a key demand of the new international economic order. Twin sourced gold for wedding rings, bringing the anti-apartheid symbol, cigars from Nicaragua, and metals and textiles from Cuba. So where are we then today? In far too many ways, it's true. The new international economic order is outdated. For example, whereas 30% of the world's population who were developing countries owned 70% of the world's wealth, that has now almost reversed. Some IMF estimates put 59% of the world's GDP in the hands of emerging markets like India and China. India just 2 weeks ago surpassed Britain in size as an economy. To quote a report from the Transnational Institute, in 2000, when Beijing launched its official going out policy, Chinese outbound foreign direct investment was just $2.3 billion. In 2018 and 19, it was $129.8 billion, taking the total stock from $27.8 billion to $1.94 trillion. Today, of the Fortune 500 list of the world's largest companies, 119 are Chinese, just behind the United States. And even though inequality between the developing countries and the former colonizers has been bridged to a degree, or in fact, contemporary colonizers, considering that decolonization hasn't been finished, global inequality has not, demonstrating that, as it turns out, proletarian classes might in fact be a better vocabulary than proletarian nations to understand the 21st century. The global top 10% of the world's population owns 76% of total household wealth and captures 52% of the total income in 2021. The global bottom 50% owns only 2% of global wealth at purchasing power parity. This has led even the World Economic Forum to admit that, open quote, while over the last 2 decades, global inequalities between countries have declined, income inequality has increased within most countries. Or let's put this in another way. The transnational capitalist class, which shoves its money in tax havens across the world, has become more diverse. Many of its members are the millionaire and billionaire children of those very elites from the global majority who were calling for a new international economic order in the mid-1970s. A worry and prospect that thinkers like Amilcar Cabral, Frantz Fanon, and Walter Rodney warned us about in the years to follow decolonization. And that required a historic Faustian bargain. That meant that they had to give in to global neoliberalism. They had to abandon the new international economic order to benefit from the new world that was to come. And I think in these times of global economic and ecological catastrophe, it's also, of course, the case that talk about the right to the full exploitation of the resource of one's country, which was animated the new international economic order, is just not fit for a world that is becoming, ecologically at risk. But the new international economic order, which both imploded and exploded, still can provide a guiding light for the fair trade movement. We need still to rein in the power of global corporations. We need still to ensure that massive wealth transfers happen not from the rich countries to the poor countries, but from the rich people of the world to the poor people of the world. We need to ensure that the world becomes more global and less parochial. Otherwise, fair trade will lose to the big corporations, who use the symbol and certification until they could dispense of it when convenient, a process which is occurring right before our very eyes. So where next? Let's start conversations with the Tax Justice Network, with the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists who have revealed the extent to which to which our money has been stolen from the global elites, and with the progressive sections of the UN. Fair trade must return to its roots, I worry that it shall perish. So thank you, and I look forward to the questions and discussions.